Chapter 16, Part 1. Evolution, Bias and Worldviews. The suffering of the world is, according to Christian doctrine, part of God's design. It is impossible to accept this view unless one is willing to attribute to God a degree of cruelty which in human beings would be regarded as diabolical. Bertrand Russell. In formulating the concept of a rational God, we inevitably confront geological and paleontological evidence, which starkly reveals pain, disease, death, and errors, realities an ideal God seemingly ought to have avoided. Indeed, creation has deviated from the perfect course, and the world was consequently set on the same path for man's sake, but evolution suggests a different sequence. The world was altered first, and humanity simply emerged within this altered state. If God sought to correct humanity, such intervention could only have occurred post factum. Let us begin with a position that aligns most closely with standard scientific interpretations, one that seeks to reconcile the theory of evolution with the concept of a benevolent and rational prime source. Typical responses to the apparent contradiction between millions of years of suffering and the character of an ideal God often include, "God knows," "It is an allegory we will understand later," or "This is the best path for forming the ideal personality for an ideal world." However, a skeptic exploring the idea of a rational God will find these answers unsatisfactory. The first two do not address the question at hand, and the third is unconvincing. Personality emerges only after enduring this meat grinder. And it is difficult to imagine how such a history could positively transform human consciousness. Even invoking the concept of worldview balance to ensure freedom of choice independent of God seems excessive. A simpler intervention, such as creating a physical anomaly that alters isotope decay rates through a radiation cataclysm, could have achieved the same purpose. This would provide enough empirical data to interpret the countless varieties of animals, inevitably similar to one another, as transitional forms sparing the world a prolonged period of suffering before humanity's advent, while still preserving freedom of choice through an alternative worldview. I remind readers of our earlier discussion on the nuances of the worldview balance theory, which allows life to proceed without constant thoughts of God. Nevertheless, let us attempt to rationalize this version by resolving the contradictions between the motives of an ideal God and the results observed, where evolution is perceived as God's tool for achieving something greater. Although science has found this tool and cleaned it of its dirt and blood, it has not uncovered any fingerprints of God. Some even claim to have taken it into their own hands, managing it far more efficiently than its presumed creator. This concept might align with empirical evidence, but does it incorporate logic and morality, elements essential for successfully rationalizing this model? Why would God create the world through pain? Perhaps the answer does not lie in the dubious allegory of a difficult path to perfection, but in the fall of angels preceding Earth's creation. If sin represents a desire for autonomy from the laws of life, and if God creates conditions for the realization of will as a chance to comprehend the futility of alternative paths, then angels should have been granted the same fate as humans, the right to their own piece of reality within God. However, if natural evil on earth is necessary for the realization of human free will, a concept discussed in Chapter 7, the suffering of creation prior to the emergence of sentient beings remains puzzling. If this domain was meant for the realization of angelic will, why do we not observe the complete arbitrariness of the fallen angels? If their autonomy became limited with the emergence of human personality and its rights to independent reality, where is the angels' right to their own reality now? If their time for weighing pros and cons has expired, was their autonomy canceled? And if so, why were they not eliminated? Let us suppose that angels have always had a realm for expressing their thoughts and feelings parallel to earthly reality. What then is their relation to the emergence of evil on earth? If this is a foresight of creation's inevitable fall and the prudent establishment of autonomous conditions on autopilot to allow humanity the eventual realization of free will, why not activate these conditions only upon the emergence of sentient personalities, avoiding millions of years of suffering in the organic interior meant to house these personalities? Perhaps this reflects the will of the fallen angels, which God honored by preserving their personalities until they could fully comprehend their own ideas. Humanity's fall is clear to God, and a platform balanced on the fine line between realities has been granted to all. Yet, this raises a critical question. Where is humanity's right to at least attempt to begin its journey correctly? If we were to evaluate human life solely by the principle that everyone will die anyway, we would embody evil itself. Suppose there had been a chance at some stage to halt everything, transform the earth, and set humanity on a path of rapid development. Something akin to direct contact between God and each tribe of Cro-Magnons, with nominal prohibitions to at least mitigate harm where possible. However, according to the allegorical story of Adam and Eve, this communication failed to materialize, or people consistently rejected such an advisor and invented their own gods. The fall was not about rejecting absolute perfection, but about refusing to follow God's corrective and formative advice, where moral obligations evolved alongside humanity. The failure to meet moral potential manifested in harmful and destructive practices that emerged during a period when humans already had the capacity to comprehend these behaviors and their consequences. I acknowledge that this explanation might seem convoluted, perhaps even amusing, but proponents of such views typically avoid specifics. They merely outline the principle of God's guidance throughout evolution, a process unfolding amidst the chaos and arbitrariness of an autonomous reality resistant to His influence. At some point, it is believed that God began guiding the pinnacle of His creation through verbal and later written instructions. According to this perspective, the suffering of living beings stems from a world created within the framework of already existing sin, where angels, divided into those for and against God, needed to witness the consequences of arbitrary patterns. If God had isolated the world from angelic influences, denying them the opportunity to act as gods within a fragment of reality, He would have needed to create a separate realm for them. In such a scenario, angels would have been excluded from humanity's ideal reality, meaning the devil could not have spoken through the serpent in Eden. However, this influence might have been permitted by humanity's own decision to approach the forbidden fruit, which symbolizes a choice toward an alternative reality. This alternative needed to be available, at least as information, from the moment human consciousness emerged, enabling the activation of free will. Therefore, I see no compelling reason to follow this particular interpretation unless we reduce the discussion to the simplistic assertion that God knows best. Another question naturally arises. Does this mean that Homo sapiens will supernaturally evolve in eternity into beings with more advanced cognitive capacities, enabling them to fully grasp life's comprehensive laws and choose between them and an alternative? Or does God only accept individuals from eras of developed religious thought, when an awareness of broader moral responsibilities had already emerged? A more inclusive interpretation would propose that all those who genuinely strove for accessible moral understanding and intuitive aspects of righteousness will be accepted. During the 1000-year reign, they would then be given the opportunity to embrace the remaining principles of happiness. Meanwhile, species that did not develop personal self-awareness and were driven purely by instinct and basic needs could be transformed into new species, enriching the diversity of the renewed world after the contraction of the old universe. Perhaps this interpretation aligns with a consistent framework, but it requires a significant allegorization of Scripture, or even a reassessment of its relevance. It also assumes that the suffering of animals must be viewed on a scale of overall suffering as insignificant compared to the salvation of future humanity. While this idea might fit into a logical sequence of events, it undeniably diminishes the moral standing of an ideal God. The only lifeline for this explanation would be the argument that we cannot fully understand the dilemmas of eternity that compelled God to use this method of creation. Still, such an interpretation feels unnecessarily convoluted. A simpler justification might be found in a hybrid creationist model, where God, through His omnipotence, instantly creates matter with all the complex characteristics necessary for functioning within established patterns. This includes layers of rock at varying depths, already containing isotopes and their decay products in proportions now observed as markers of half-lives. Similarly, Adam's creation assumes an adult form, bypassing infancy and rapid cell development. His skin would have been fully formed with layers of epidermis, keratinocytes, which produce keratin to strengthen and waterproof the skin, and the outer stratum corneum. The difference before the fall is that these layers could function without shedding, fulfilling their roles without the active cell death that followed humanity's sin. While this idea may sound no less fantastical than the initial version, it avoids unnecessary suffering and complications. After all, if we posit an omnipotent God, it seems naive to be surprised by disruptions to natural laws as we understand them. Regarding the empirical evidence of the Earth's age observable through radiocarbon dating, the Bible describes a pre-flood Earth irrigated by mist, with an oxygen-rich atmosphere and a higher surface temperature. These conditions could suggest faster isotope decay rates, which maintained the Earth's necessary temperature and facilitated the evaporation of underground moisture. After the fall, these processes became increasingly disrupted, and the decay of isotopes may have gradually accelerated. God could have intervened through natural anomalies to achieve his purposes, for example, releasing heated underground reservoirs enriched with isotope decay products. The rate of isotope decay may have been even more rapid over several years or decades, warming the Earth and facilitating the continental drift that unfolded in the following centuries. The accumulated mist then fell as precipitation in underground reservoirs flooded the once flat surface of the Earth, sorting isotopes in sedimentary layers according to their natural weight and tendency to settle through wet rock, with parent isotopes more abundant near the surface and daughter isotopes deeper. This would create a multi-age effect enhanced by reseeding and evaporating waters, along with the subsequent circulation of groundwater. Indirect evidence for this includes microfractures in rocks and the uneven global distribution of isotopes, such as their concentration in Australia, possibly due to prolonged continental drift and major faults in the Earth's crust. If not for the assumption that isotopes existed in preformed proportions, this theory would face a significant thermal balance problem. The amount of heat required to account for the decay of parent isotopes into such quantities of daughter isotopes would be comparable to the energy released by the simultaneous explosion of hundreds of hydrogen bombs, which would have evaporated all water and annihilated life. This assumption, however, skirts dangerously close to solipsism. As unfortunate as it may seem in the pursuit of the most rational conception of God, we are inevitably drawn toward the boundary where creationists seek arguments in dimly lit laboratories by candlelight. We will not step into their domain, as it risks both credibility and privacy, but we will attempt something even more daring. We will lay a path leading toward it. Since my expertise does not enable me to confirm or refute their claims, I will examine the religious naturalistic conflict through the lens of psychology, to which I have devoted much of my life. As Niels Bohr famously said, the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. To shape reality, one need only place words in a specific context. Imagine finding yourself in a situation where you must choose a religion or feel a sincere desire to uncover some supernatural internal resources when the material world has offered no help. How would you decide among thousands of interpretations ranging from peculiar and, at times, terrifying ancient texts to modern revelations based on 20th and 21st century technologies and discoveries? Undoubtedly, for most adherents of these diverse beliefs, the decision is influenced by circumstances and the human factor, such as the need to be accepted within the dominant society or local environment, and less frequently by romantic feelings or their potential. In all cases, we adjust for the relative alignment of personal preferences. A skeptic, governed by the same psychological mechanisms, might find satisfaction in aligning with the closest approximation of objective reality, or, in theistic terms, with truth. But what criteria could satisfy such an unusual demand of human nature, one that defies the innate desire for dominance? I realize that in this paragraph, I have likely managed to offend everyone, as we all consider ourselves objective and driven solely by a desire for facts and truth. This paradox, where each group is convinced of its own correctness, will occupy our attention in the reflections that follow. This may sound like blasphemy, but often even a skeptic remains firmly rooted in atheism, not because it is an incontrovertible fact, since people are rarely interested in facts unless they serve personal gain, but because it appears irrefutable, which implies dominance. Of course, facts and personal gain frequently overlap, but this does not diminish the primacy of the desire for dominance when compared to mere factual interest. Everyone wants what they value, or what they identify with, to hold a position of dominance, at least in some regard. We care about our countries and their prosperity largely because it allows us to feel pride in something to which we are indirectly connected. To maintain this pride, we often exaggerate, deceive, engage in self-persuasion, or diminish the accomplishments of others. Do you think I'm being overly cynical, painting human nature in an unnecessarily negative light? Yet this aspect of our psychology is evident in nearly every historical document, often summarized by the familiar phrase, "The victors write history." Even when these narratives are contested, the nations victorious in World War II invariably consider themselves the primary contributors to victory, relegating others to secondary roles. Yet, statistics reveal that 4 out of 5 Nazi German soldiers perished on the Eastern Front. A less partial observer, someone not invested in the Allied victory, might notice that each nation sought primarily to safeguard its own interests, biding time until its adversaries were exhausted, or a decisive triumph presented an opportunity to align with the winning side. Only after the Soviet Union had shattered the core of fascist forces, liberated much of Europe, and threatened to extend its reach across Germany and beyond, did the Allies open the Second Front, at a point when Germany's defeat was all but assured. This sequence of events reinforces the impression that little has changed since the dawn of evolution. The world still revolves around the division of power and influence, veiled by layers of illusion akin to fresh paint concealing rusted railings, functional only as a fleeting aesthetic. At its core, history boils down to a matter of selective storytelling, a choice among infinite facts. Of course, no one would present it as such, as that would strip history of its nobility and undermine its narrative authority. While we might acknowledge the bravery of individual soldiers as heroic in itself, the motives of the politicians orchestrating military actions are often far removed from such ideals. This line of thought unsettles us not merely because it challenges familiar interpretations, but because it exposes how much we personally identify with past glories. We take pride in our nation's scientific achievements, even if our only contribution to science has been pressing equals on a calculator. We grandly invoke the names of renowned scientists born on our patch of Earth, no different from any other, as if their triumphs were somehow our own, while treating chemistry as little more than arcane sorcery that transforms humble potatoes into crisps with enigmatic E-numbers. Philosopher Slavoj Žižek aptly notes that ideology operates less as an explicit set of beliefs and more as an unconscious framework shaping how we perceive reality. He argues that ideology is not about what we know, but about what we do instinctively. Our biases are so ingrained that even crediting another nation with a dish we consider our own can strain relations almost as much as warfare. For example, disputes over the origins of chicken tikka masala between India and Britain, or debates between England and Ireland over soda bread, illustrate how profoundly food-related patriotism can divide us. Add to this the rivalry between the French and British over the origins of fish and chips, and one begins to wonder whether the French even attempted to popularize frogs as a delicacy in England, only to be met with a resounding misfire. Serious disputes over cultural ownership rarely hold water. Centuries of shared traditions make it nearly impossible to pinpoint the origins of any dish. Who first baked potatoes in an open fire, or accidentally dropped beets into soup, and whether they were in the same pot? Even if someone can't boil water, they might still insist that their ancestors' recipes are encoded in their DNA, proudly claiming ownership of culinary traditions to which they have no direct connection. What we often call cultural values and patriotism is, in reality, an evolutionary quirk of the human brain. Blinded by this bias, we fail to recognize that what we truly seek is personal validation through tenuous associations, defending positions that bolster our sense of self-worth. This tendency to invent myths about cultural purity and national uniqueness aligns closely with historian Eric Hobsbawm's concept of invented traditions. Hobsbawm demonstrated how many supposedly ancient customs are, in fact, recent constructs designed to reinforce national identity. For instance, the modern Scottish kilt, far from being a timeless symbol, was created in the 18th century. Its predecessor was a large piece of cloth draped around the body like a toga, bearing little resemblance to the tailored garment we know today. Steven Pinker argued that our brains did not evolve to perceive the world as it truly is, but rather to interpret it in ways that helped our ancestors survive. Our brains are shaped for fitness, not for truth. Sometimes the truth is adaptive, but sometimes it is not. This implies that we filter reality through constructs designed to reinforce tribal unity and demonize external threats, fostering a fear of isolation or estrangement from the group. This tendency manifests in how we hurl negative labels at one another, as if playing a game of hot potato. Consider Hitler, a figure tossed back and forth between atheists and theists, each weaponizing him to discredit the other. Occasionally, even vegetarians are bewilderingly dragged into this game. Not that they are troubled much. After all, Hitler's central ideology clearly wasn't derived from a book about healthy eating, urging the extermination of meat eaters while treating pescatarians and the plant-curious as inferior. We all strive to maintain a sense of superiority by clinging to the idea that our worldview is flawless and entirely beneficial, incapable of arising from or coexisting with imperfection. However, history demonstrates that both theism and atheism can be twisted into grotesque shapes if untethered from humanism. Hitler could have adopted any identity, but he was decidedly not a humanist. Humanism, by contrast, can be co-opted by anyone, and it is this adaptable quality that everyone wants to modify and attribute to the core of their worldview. If he did this, he could not have been a Christian. It contradicts its fundamental teachings, or similar arguments invoking the no true Scotsman fallacy. Examples of how we replace reality with illusions are endless, but let us cut to the paradox. If evolution suggests we pursue truth because it aids survival, then the deliberate creation of illusions, or the desire to self-deceive, is as anomalous as an animal convincing itself a snake is merely a stick to ease its anxiety. Yet, distorting reality functions as an evolutionary necessity akin to camouflage in animals, a tool for survival or dominance. This principle holds even though no creature wishes to be deceived. Nature itself operates as a competition of illusions, where beings create deceptions to gain dominance, including within their own species, whether through displays of superiority, adaptive mimicry, or even artificial coloration. According to evolutionary theory, humans have not shed this universal trait. On the contrary, we have honed it into a pathological tendency to reshape reality for our benefit. Our species' success hinges on a principle: deceive, but deceive so well that the deception remains unnoticed. Primatologists Richard Byrne and Andrew Whiten support this idea of perfect illusions as an evolutionary advantage and argue that primates' intelligence evolved primarily to navigate social interactions rather than abstract problem-solving. Thus, our cognitive abilities often serve the creation of convincing illusions more than they do the pursuit of objective reality. This is mirrored in cognitive science, where biases like the halo effect illustrate how our minds act less like impartial judges seeking truth and more like advocates defending pre-existing beliefs. Evolution has paired this drive to deceive with an equally powerful desire for social acceptance. These dual impulses, deception for dominance and the need for social cohesion, are among humanity's most defining traits. At an individual level, we construct realities that serve our interests, shaping them with dreams, ideologies, personal goals, and self-images. Yet no one wishes to inhabit their constructed reality alone. To persuade others, we must rely on shared data, established logic, and moral frameworks. Disagreements often center on causality or interpretation, not the existence of basic facts. Historically, our ancestors sought to convince one another through demonstrations of strength or claims to superior knowledge, much like a rooster pecking at the ground to attract attention, even if there was nothing there. As species' cognitive complexity increased, so did the sophistication of their deceptions. This dynamic gave rise to shamans, tribal figures who communicated with nature by interpreting animal behavior. They competed for dominance, weaving facts with fiction to construct compelling narratives. As human knowledge expanded, the demand for alignment with empirical facts increased, but our genetic proclivity for illusion persisted. Today, this manifests as confirmation bias, a challenge even in scientific circles, where attempts to counter it have been less than successful. Periods of societal upheaval highlight these biases most clearly, as collective worldviews fracture under existential pressures. During such times, our reliance on constructed narratives becomes acute. An objection might arise. If humans create illusions to bolster survival and dominance, do we not also seek truth for ourselves, avoiding deception by others? This instinct is observable in nature, too. However, the core mechanism at play is not a drive for truth, but an aversion to immediate problems. For example, a large herbivore encountering a bug feigning death has no incentive to verify the bug's behavior, since it poses no threat. Similarly, a predator lying on grass has no need to determine whether the grass is truly withered or mimicking this appearance for protection. Evolution has not instilled in us a drive for objective truth, but rather an instinct to avoid discomfort and danger. As Leon Festinger remarked, when facts contradict our beliefs, we tend to change our perception of the facts, not the beliefs. Beliefs form a social structure, and for humans, the group's cohesion is paramount. Even in science, we are often motivated by a desire for recognition and influence within a community. It is easy to see that believers typically adopt faith due to birth circumstances or social environment. Yet the paradox is that atheists also do not arrive at their worldview purely through impartial reasoning. Instead, facts serve as markers of the dominance of a concept, signifying the stability and viability of its social group. Our attachment to facts, then, is itself an illusion we project both to others and to ourselves, as aligning with the core truths of a community enhances our sense of security and acceptance. Those who conform to a group's central beliefs face a reduced risk of social exclusion. The height of this illusion is the perception that individuals who appear detached from social concerns are, paradoxically, the closest to the group's unifying core. They seem to embody the group's ideals, becoming focal points themselves. This grants them a unique autonomy, a freedom from the fear of isolation. Such individuals often distance themselves from the central group, forming their own sphere of influence, much like solar systems orbiting within a galaxy. This dynamic echoes Jung's archetype of the wise hermit, who represents truth precisely because of his apparent detachment from social validation and personal gain. Of course, there are also sociopaths, distinct from introverts, whose detachment from social norms stems from extreme narcissism. These individuals avoid social interaction and instead construct imaginary worlds filled with self-defined values and exaggerated notions of their own importance. They may believe that rational members of society silently admire their outlook, or they might even invent a circle of imaginary supporters. Such behavior mirrors certain personality disorders, where the need for validation manifests in distorted, internalized forms. However, humanity's inherent social dependence does not diminish our fundamental need to navigate and survive in the physical world. We continue to apply factual knowledge pragmatically, focusing on achieving tangible outcomes. When it comes to ideology, whether in the form of historical narratives or speculative constructs, we consistently adapt our understanding to fit prevailing social norms. Over time, we have honed an acute awareness of which facts are critical for maintaining a comfortable existence, and which beliefs are essential for fostering social harmony. If you question the inherent bias of our species, consider this thought experiment. Imagine discovering documents that could significantly rehabilitate someone like Hitler, only to misplace them shortly afterward. Would you then publicly declare that he wasn't as deplorable as history suggests, even if the document seemed logically compelling? It's unlikely. Who would risk making such a claim based solely on facts without the support of a group or community? Most people wouldn't, even if groups of like-minded supporters existed but lacked sufficient social backing and faced marginalization or ostracism from the wider community. Let me emphasize that this is a purely hypothetical example and should not be misconstrued as justifying Nazism. This scenario vividly illustrates the spiral of silence theory proposed by German political scientist Elisabeth Noelle Neumann. According to this theory, individuals tend to withhold opinions and suppress factual information if they perceive themselves to be in the minority, fearing social isolation. In extreme cases, this can escalate into a kind of Stockholm syndrome, where people begin to identify with and defend ideas that were initially alien to them, as though their survival depended on it. A similar pattern emerges in the academic realm with the phenomenon of groupthink, first articulated by psychologist Irving Janis. Janis demonstrated how even highly qualified experts can fall victim to irrational decision-making under the pressure to conform. He observed, "The more amiability and esprit de corps there is among the members of a policy-making in-group, the greater the danger that independent critical thinking will be replaced by groupthink, which is likely to result in irrational and dehumanizing actions directed against outgroups. This represents a kind of tyranny of dominant opinion. During wartime, for example, individuals in enemy territory or captivity may become fervent supporters of the opposing side, demonstrating loyalty to ensure their survival. This phenomenon is well documented through psychological experiments. For instance, Solomon Asch's famous research revealed that individuals often align with a group's incorrect consensus, even when it contradicts their own perceptions. When surrounded by confederates who unanimously give the wrong answer, participants frequently hesitate to contradict the majority. They begin doubting their own senses, sometimes genuinely altering their perceptions to match the group's opinion. Biologist Robert Trivers suggested that self-deception may have evolved as a strategy to deceive others more effectively. As he argued, self-deception evolves in the service of deceit, the better to fool others. In essence, social cohesion and recognition often trump objective facts. Much like a predator indifferent to whether grass truly mimics wilted foliage, we dismiss theories and hypotheses that fail to resonate with our immediate social group or lack endorsement from credible alternative communities where we might find refuge if shunned. Indicators of bias. No matter how much we consider ourselves evidentialists, detached from bias and free from the influence of worldview interpretations of data, traces of such tendencies are unmistakably present in various arguments and conclusions. A striking example lies in the difficulty of reconciling the laws of thermodynamics with the hypothesis of an infinite singularity. In response, we often equate belief in God with naturalism, posing a symmetrical question to theists. If God created everything, then who created God? This reflects our struggle to delineate the boundaries of competing worldviews. Another blind spot in atheistic reasoning emerges when responding to religious statements like, God either exists or does not exist. Neither can be proven nor disproven, so everyone simply chooses a worldview position. Atheists typically counter this by claiming they make no such choice, as they see no equally well-founded alternative explanation for reality. Thus, they position themselves on a shared empirical understanding of the world. Yet, no one suggests that observing autonomous processes governed solely by physical laws constitutes proof of God's non-existence. It's merely that invoking a deity is seen as a redundant hypothesis, introducing an unverifiable entity. Bertrand Russell's critique, that theistic concepts fail to convince even one another while still agreeing on the existence of something beyond blind physical laws, suggests that a universal theistic alternative has not yet been discovered. Stephen Roberts expressed a similar sentiment more succinctly. I contend that we are both atheists. I just believe in one God fewer than you do. When you understand why you dismiss all the other possible gods, you will understand why I dismiss yours. Yet, even the skeptic must concede that if an alternative model aligns with factual evidence, logic, and morality, we are left with a choice between two equally valid explanations of reality, a decision rooted in worldview, not a definitive conclusion. The flaw in Russell's argument lies in its failure to acknowledge that all worldviews ultimately reduce to two fundamental concepts. Either something exists or it does not, either by spontaneous emergence or intentional creation. Much like the medical adage, the patient is either alive or dead. Even if we successfully explain the morphology of religious feeling and the origins of religion with logic and plausibility, this does not inherently negate the concept of God. The anthropic principle, or the fine-tuning of the universe, often leaves us in awe. On closer examination, it is often attributed to selective perception, akin to survivor bias. We marvel at the unique conditions of our existence as miraculous, yet if these conditions were absent, no one would be here to observe them. and the miracle would not exist. While this explanation appears to be a satisfactory answer, it fails to address the religious argument for intentional design. The counter-argument can always be reduced to an absurdity. No matter how unique or compelling a phenomenon pointing to a creator might appear, it could perpetually be dismissed as survivor bias. Imagine, for instance, witnessing a soul departing the body at death and ascending. One could argue, there's nothing surprising. If we had no soul, there would be no one to observe its departure. We might rationalize this as an energy imprint, consisting of photons that eventually disperse into the ecosystem, hypothetically ascending to the upper atmosphere before settling back into the environment. This energy would then be reabsorbed through food, creating a background necessary for our existence. At the same time, contrary to atheistic conclusions, religious believers do not claim the absolute perfection of current conditions, which, according to religious paradigms, will only exist in eternity. In this view, the ideal constants of the universe have been deliberately altered in the present to accommodate human autonomy. This alteration leads to the collision of patterns and a deviation from the original order of creation. The tendency of the masses to accept a dominant ideology reflects one of the most superficial arguments often employed by atheists, revealing a clear lapse in logical reasoning. It is akin to misunderstanding the evolutionary role of the endocrine system, exemplified by the question, why do men have nipples? A similar simplification arises in the argument, can God create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it? If God were to create such a stone, it would have to be infinite, thereby displacing God himself, since logic dictates that two infinities cannot coexist. Thus, the question inherently asks whether God can simultaneously exist and not exist, a contradiction by definition. Atheistic enthusiasm for debunking religious ideas also reflects an evolutionary bias. This bias often manifests in an emotional tone or strained responses when refuting religious concepts. Such reactions are conspicuously absent when discussing myths or legends, such as the Greek pantheon, which are treated as cultural artifacts rather than objects of contention. Religion, too, is often addressed in this way. However, the tone changes sharply when someone attempts to rationalize or establish a religious worldview on a logical foundation. These efforts are frequently preemptively dismissed as threats to the dominant secular worldview. But even if an objectively harmless concept were discovered, we would still attribute harm, illogicality, or factual inconsistencies to it, driven by the fear of undermining the dominance of our worldview. This fear stems from the need to recognize that such a worldview is not an ultimate foundation, but rather one of many perspectives, which could lead to a collapse of dominance. The status of a neutral position may itself conceal an inherent bias, operating through unspoken evolved mechanisms designed to guard against perceived threats. This doesn't require a conspiracy to explain, any more than collective panic does. We perceive data in a unified way when we share a common understanding of the world order. Regardless of time, geography, or context, humanity's interpretations of reality typically fall into two fundamental categories. Either something exists or nothing exists. Even seemingly alternative theories, like those proposing that life was delivered to Earth by an external agent, still operate within this dichotomy, merely applied on a grander cosmic scale. The interpretation of data among adherents to these two primary worldviews does not vary significantly regardless of when or where they lived. Differences emerge only in the auxiliary hypotheses layered over previous conclusions, forming what philosopher Imre Lakatos described as a protective belt of supporting assumptions. The presence of believers who favor gradualism or evolution does not necessarily guarantee the objectivity of this part of one of the two worldview positions in research and data interpretation. Individuals with such worldviews defend them as passionately as one would protect a belief in God, which becomes an integral part of the viability of that worldview, working as a defense mechanism on the principle of auxiliary hypotheses. Humans are fundamentally incapable of pure objectivity. Facts are inevitably subject to interpretation. As Nietzsche asserted, there are no facts, only interpretations. In my view, nothing warrants greater scrutiny in science than a consensus around conclusions that cannot be empirically verified. This phenomenon goes beyond Henri Tajfel's in-group favoritism or Daniel Kahneman's halo effect, both of which describe how collective consensus can overshadow accuracy. In scientific communities, the emphasis often shifts from achieving precision to maintaining the coherence of a shared perspective. This is not merely a social phenomenon, but a deeply ingrained genetic predisposition, shaped by fast-thinking processes that favor consistency and the minimization of cognitive dissonance. To validate this perspective, we might observe several societal indicators. 1. The deliberate suppression or omission of positive data from surveys, research, articles, books, influential figures, organizations, and so on. 2. The establishment of barriers preventing individuals with alternative worldviews from occupying positions of trust, such as roles in science or leadership positions. I am skeptical about information indicating worldview leveling by those who can make such decisions. Otherwise, they simply would not have ended up in these positions. Nevertheless, this thought was sparked by Robert Sapolsky, whose work I deeply respect. In one lecture, he noted that believing students generally do poorly on his exams for understandable reasons, implying their perceived inadequacy. But what if this bias is a semi-conscious effort to safeguard the future of science and civilization? Sapolsky's assertion that we lack control over our desires aligns with my contention that our worldviews are shaped by biases essential for social cohesion and the minimization of stress. Similarly, Bill Nye's statement during a public debate that believers should leave their children alone because they are vital to the progress of civilization reveals an effort, conscious or not, to marginalize alternative perspectives and reinforce the dominance of the prevailing worldview. His remark, "If you want to deny evolution and live in your world, that's completely inconsistent with everything we observe in the universe, that's fine. But don't make your kids do it," underscores an instinct to secure future consensus. This instinct to assert dominance often operates subconsciously. A brief scroll through Facebook is enough to illustrate this. Of course, some may argue that Facebook's microflora is hardly comparable to the intellectual fauna of the scientific community or religious clergy. Yet, even in these circles, embellishment is not uncommon. Take, for instance, the altered texts of Josephus by devout monks, or the infamous Piltdown Man hoax, fabricated as evidence of transitional species. In both cases, the contributors likely believed they were merely assisting the acceptance of an obvious truth, while also indulging in a sense of personal contribution to the dominant narrative and its accompanying prestige. Such tendencies are reminiscent of the well-documented Dunning-Kruger effect, which reveals how humans are prone to constructing and maintaining illusions of their own superiority, even at the expense of bending facts. Human nature, it seems, is deeply flawed. Despite its noble pursuit of objective truth, even the scientific community has at times clung to theories that reinforced dominant paradigms. Evolution, after all, is a slow process. What has evolved more clearly, however, is humanity's instinct to differentiate empirical truth from ideology. Immediate, practical reality, such as the existence of gravity, is rarely distorted, as our survival depends on accurately perceiving the physical world. Most people share a common understanding of observable phenomena. The divergence arises in their interpretation of their origins, which is filtered through differing worldviews. If any concept threatens the survival of a given worldview, that concept will be adjusted or abandoned. Faced with new information, religious communities have addressed fabrications in ancient texts, while the scientific community has tackled its own fabrications and speculative theories. Just as religious leaders have apologized for past dogmas and errors, scientists revise and update what were once considered immutable truths. Both groups cite the ignorance of predecessors whose actions, such as lobotomy, eugenics, or the Inquisition's burnings, reflected human limitations, yet were committed with ostensibly good intentions. Thus, humanity has learned to navigate empirical reality while confining speculation to unverifiable realms. Yet, without external constraints, the tendency to distort facts for the sake of dominance persists. Consider a hypothetical discovery of remains resembling Neuralagus rex, a giant prehistoric rabbit, found in Cambrian strata, a finding that could destabilize established theories. A creationist might claim this species as a variation of modern hares, highlighting genetic variability and adaptability seen today. A researcher, however, might delay announcing such a discovery until an explanation, perhaps the influence of an ancient peat bog or a new dating method, emerges to align it with the prevailing narrative. This inclination to preserve dominant theories, even when faced with contradictory evidence, is deeply rooted in psychological biases. Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance explains how individuals strive to maintain belief consistency by selectively interpreting data. When faced with facts that challenge their worldview, they construct hypotheses to reconcile the conflict. As Festinger aptly noted, reality that contradicts our beliefs speaks in a language we do not hear, compelling us to translate it into one we can comprehend. Echoes of such inconsistencies can be seen in the history of dating a theropod containing bird remains in its stomach, which shifted to the late Jurassic period, and proto-ovis from the Triassic period, described by paleontologist Sankar Chatterjee. These discoveries sparked controversy as they challenged the generally accepted evolutionary timelines. Many scientists expressed skepticism about the dating or argued that proto-ovis's remains were too fragmentary, only 30–40% complete, and poorly preserved to support any definitive conclusions. It is important to note that not every discovery undergoes scrutiny by every skeptic. Practical limitations make this impossible. Typically, scientists rely on research reports, analyses, and conclusions, often favoring data that supports the prevailing paradigm. If doubt arises, findings may be revisited, but standard discoveries, like a well-documented trilobite, are rarely re-examined. A similar pattern can be observed in the acceptance of Australopithecus afarensis. Despite the existence of only 4 relatively complete specimens, ranging from 80% to 40% completeness, subsequent finds, teeth, skull fragments, and tibial bones, were often evaluated based on documentation alone. These partial specimens, ranging from 2% to 20% completeness, eventually expanded to approximately 400 examples of A. afarensis. Philosopher of science Imre Lakatos noted that researchers often defend a theory's hardcore by adjusting auxiliary hypotheses, which can create the illusion of an overwhelming dataset resistant to scrutiny. The evolutionary bias of our species subtly emerged in Mary Schweitzer's discovery of soft tissues in a T-Rex fossil. Expressing concern, she asked, "The freaking data aren't going to get me in trouble, are they? Just make sure they don't shoot the messenger." This reaction was highlighted in National Geographic's 2006 article, Dinosaur Shocker. The public announcement of Schweitzer's groundbreaking discovery came 10 months after the initial find in June 2004, with the official publication appearing in Science magazine in March 2005. In the years that followed, various research groups analyzed individual fossil samples, uncovering preserved organic molecules like collagen in dinosaur bones estimated to be tens of millions of years old. These studies confirmed the presence of preserved organics, though each case involved limited sampling. In 2015, a team led by Filippo Bertazzo analyzed 8 randomly selected dinosaur bones from different locations and found preserved organics in 6 of them. These included remnants of erythrocytes and collagen fragments, suggesting that organic material is preserved with a surprisingly high frequency, about 75% in this instance. What stands out in this story is the scientific community's reaction, marked by surprise, doubt, and fear of marginalization. The delay in announcing Schweitzer's discovery, which was unusual for paleontological finds, may have resulted not only from the need for rigorous replication and analysis, but also from the necessity of crafting a robust explanation, as one article noted, to avoid panic. As subsequent studies demonstrated the reproducibility of these findings, public acknowledgement became inevitable. Psychologist Kevin Dunbar's research supports this perspective. His studies of real-world laboratories reveal that scientists often dismiss or rationalize anomalous data to align with existing theories. He observed, "Scientists have a strong tendency to seek and interpret data in ways that are consistent with their current theories. This highlights a profound and enduring bias. The need to protect one's career, often tied to securing tenure and publishing in prestigious journals." Sabine Hossenfelder, in her book Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray, argues that academic pressures often compel scientists to favor results that align with community expectations, rather than pursue groundbreaking discoveries. The desire for acceptance within academia can lead researchers to prioritize conformity with prevailing norms over the pursuit of empirical truth. The scientific community has developed safeguards like peer review to mitigate bias, striving to create an external observer effect. Yet, my argument is that deception and self-deception are intrinsic to human nature. The notion of a genetic predisposition toward truth is, in reality, little more than a pathological drive to construct illusions, ultimately serving the aim of dominance.